So welcome. I'm Joy Ritchie. I'm the Director of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs here at UCA. This is our fourth Faculty Research Symposium of this academic year. I want to thank the University Research Council, who've been my partners in developing and planning this event. They have been a pleasure to work with and great fun, and I think we've all really enjoyed these events. And I want to go ahead and thank our presenters for being brave enough to come do 3-slide presentations and put their work out there. I really enjoy these events. It is a real joy to hear about the work that's happening on campus that we don't hear about otherwise. I mentioned this was the fourth in a series. We started out talking about location and place was our first theme. We have learned about technology the next time. Our last one was about interdisciplinary collaboration. And of course, today we're talking about diversity, belonging, inclusion, and equity. And I know this is a really important topic for UCA as an institution and for every individual who I interact with here on campus. And I'm really happy that we're closing out with this topic. I've had the pleasure of already seeing the slides, so I know we're going to hear about a lot of really great work on the topic of diversity, belonging, inclusion, and equity. Just to quickly touch base about the schedule, I will hand it off to Sandy Longhorn. She's a member of the University Research Council, and she has served as sort of the facilitator for these events, and she will walk our presenters through their 3-minute presentations, and they'll go back to back. They'll be real quick, so pay attention, take notes if you want. After that, you'll have the option to choose a breakout room and go into the breakout room of the presenter of your choice. We'll be in breakout rooms for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back together, and Sandy will lead us in lead our presenters in a panel conversation about the topic to help establish some connections across presentations and research and connect things that are going on campus. So that's what's going to happen. And I guess with that, Sandy, I will hand it off to you.
Thanks, Joy. And thank you for all the hard work on this. This has really been an amazing project, and I have learned so much about my colleagues across the university by participating in these. And I think it's only going to grow into more fabulous things moving forward. So today we will be starting with Dr. Hilary Anderson from the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Dr. Anderson.
Okay, sorry, I had to get myself unmuted. So when they asked me to do this, I didn't really know how my stuff fit in with DBIE, except that my historical research seeks out underrepresented activists in the national narratives for LGBTQ+ rights. And national narratives of queer history, in particular gay rights movements, tends to be a story of the coasts. So I wanted to know more about Southern identities and how that fit in with national narratives. And as it turns out in my research, the activists that I located that are working in the South or talking about the South were also doing DBIE work, even though it wasn't called that in the 70s and early 1980s. So in this article that I am looking at and worked on, I'm basically talking about two folks, Patricia Cooks, who's known in the lesbian feminist community by the early 1970s as Pat Parker, and Maybelle or Mabe Segrest. Pat Parker was originally from Houston, Texas. She went to Worthing High School, and Mabe Segrest was from Macon County, Alabama. And what I'm looking at specifically through Pat Parker's papers was to figure out how Pat Parker, who becomes a Black lesbian feminist poet, left her home in Houston, even though she was young, but the South still had an impact on how her identity formed and how it shaped her activism. And then by the late 1960s, she had established herself as a cultural producer in the lesbian feminist community. So I'm basically taking work that Mabe Seagrass did in the journal that she edited called Feminary, where she's looking at these 4 questions about Southern identity. Southern lesbian migration, Black women in the South, and Southerner as other. And Pat Parker was one who migrated out of the South. She goes from Houston to California, where she marries a guy named Ed Bullens, who is a member of the Black Panther Party. You can go ahead and change the slide. And what we see through her letters, Pat Parker's letters, is that she felt othered in different ways. I specifically looked at a series of letters with her, one of her high school friends, Carolyn Burney. She talks about feeling othered because her friend judged Pat for wearing her hair in a natural. She also, Pat Parker tells her friend that she's not coming back to Texas because she has married a white man. And in the late 1960s, Texas still had miscegenation laws. So she was othered coming back home. But in 1975, Pat Parker comes back to Texas. That's where she comes out to her mother for the first time in 1975. And you can see there on the right, that's when she did her presentation for the Point Blank Times Lesbian Feminist Collective in Houston. And that's where she talks about her experiences in Houston. And she's really using the South as kind of a shorthand for a racial experience. And you can go to the next slide. And in 1975, when she returns home, that's also when she comes out to her mother. And she writes, Pat Parker writes to Audre Lorde about her experience coming out to her mother, which was kind of anticlimactic. Her mother said, well, as long as you're happy, it's okay with me. So the story of Pat Parker, through using Mabe Seagrass's work in Feminary kind of as a lens for Pat Parker's life, we can see how Pat Parker navigated her Southern identity and it affected her activism. So.
Thank you so much. My little chime was going off, but I was on mute, so there was no possible way you could have heard that. Little technical fail on my part. Now we have Dr. Halverson from the College of Natural Sciences and Mathematics.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. What I'm going to be talking about today is the role of mentorship in breaking down barriers for diversity in STEM. So the disciplines of science, technology, engineering, and math have a major diversity and inclusion problem. And there's a lot of barriers for these underrepresented groups in STEM. Some of the barriers that we see existing are overemphasis on objectivity in STEM. For example, many trainees and professionals in STEM there's not really a strong culture of bringing your personal, full, authentic self into the workplace. There's also can be imbalanced power dynamics during training in STEM. For example, many experts in research disciplines are not typically experts on mentorship and actually don't have a whole lot of training on how to effectively mentor and train their students. And we also see that in STEM particularly, research has a lot of privileged axes in terms of the ability to conduct research as a trainee. So for example, funding is a huge issue when it comes to research. That's something that has privilege with it. There's also physical ability to conduct research. I'm an environmental scientist, so the ability to go outdoors physically and collect physically enduring samples can be a barrier. And then finally, time of conducting research. Often science works at its own time, and the ability to spend that time can be a barrier for many underrepresented groups. I'm a gay male, and so for myself, I'm really interested in that particular group and their representation in science. There's research that for gay men and for many other groups, there's what we call a leaky pipeline, which basically means that there's less of a chance for individuals from these groups to stay in STEM, particularly during university when they're discovering themselves. Next slide. The way that I approach these barriers for breaking them down and better improving diversity in STEM is thinking about mentorship in a broader way than the specific pipeline that is often conventionally used in mentorship concepts. For example, when we think of training the STEM workforce, I think it's better to use, I'm borrowing from other workers, what's called the braided river approach. And this is one of many approaches I just wanted to throw out there. The braided river approach thinks about less of a pipeline as a one-way direction that everyone is on, we're all in the same ship, and more as there are many pathways for success in STEM. And those pathways need to be thought of critically and allow students to come and go and be supported through the bumpy segments, the segments that take many unpredictable directions during their career. We as mentors need to facilitate that, and that requires a lot of holistic support of students. Next slide. So using this braided river approach, I found many lessons over time. I'd love to talk more in the breakout room about these. Some of the lessons that have come true, and I've taken these from many mentors of my own, are broadening our definitions of what professionalism and success look like in STEM, thinking about our trainees as supporting their goals and not ours as the trainer or the mentor. Also embracing openness and visibility, particularly for those who are underrepresented groups, so that students can see themselves represented and also find community. Finally, I think it's important to support students and have empathy in STEM. And this is also an issue in the STEM disciplines. Is I think sometimes there can be a lack of empathy for people who experience bumpy segments. And then finally, recognizing that we as mentors also are navigating this river, and that effective mentorship is really hard work. So doing it right and supporting underrepresented groups, we have to be kind to ourselves and honestly model that for our students of doing self-care and doing the work at the pace that we can actually fulfill and sustain. So looking forward to talking more about mentorship, particularly in STEM in my breakout room.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Halverson. And now in our speed dating presentation approach, we'll be moving on to Dr. Lewis from the College of Business.
Well, that's a good way to put people at ease when you bring up the horror of speed dating. So I'm glad to talk to y'all today about a line of research I have with my research partner, Jennifer Flanagan at Texas Women's University. Within organizational behavior and human resource research is the idea of artifacts, with artifacts being a representation of an individual. And we're looking into the effect of having a tattoo within the workplace. And while this might seem rather outdated, what we're finding out is that maybe it's the opinions of the human resources professionals that's outdated compared to society. Going back to 1936, we found an article in Life magazine that showed that 10% of the American population had a tattoo. And that number's only gone up 10 to 15%. Most articles today showcase that 20 to 25% of the population has a tattoo. And over the last 10 years, we've seen really a glamorization of having a tattoo with shows like Miami Inc. You know, we see many more celebrities, many through social media, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, not only of people's tattoos, but of people getting tattoos. And so we're looking at the not only the impact of having a tattoo, but also the regret of getting a tattoo and how that affects one in the workplace. Next slide, please. So the first thing we looked at was who really had a tattoo, looking at the different categories of work: blue, pink, white, and gray collar. And you may not have heard of the pink collar group before. That's really where we find the service industry. And we found that people within gray collar work, which would be factory workers, civil servants, are the most likely to have a tattoo. But they're also the most likely to regret having a tattoo. And we found that this is due to a lot of tattoos being gained between the ages of 18 and 25, and then going into those professions. We also looked at people's feelings toward other people with tattoos. And in looking at a group of everyone that was a participant in the survey, we had 800 and something participants in the survey. Typically, no one had a problem with other people having a tattoo, meaning none of our means within our group actually went over the 3-point mark. And we had no significance in any of our findings, with the exception of people's feelings toward their doctor and their dentist. They don't like their doctors and dentists having tattoos. Ironically, though, people who have a tattoo were more significant in disliking other people having a tattoo. And here we found issues of race, age, and gender playing a factor in having negative feelings towards someone else having a tattoo. And of course, these are visible tattoos. Next slide, please. So just some preliminary findings. Of course, if you want to know more, come on over to the group. But we did find that people are pretty indifferent to having tattoos. and that men are more likely to have a visible tattoo than women, but just slightly. We did find that people in gray collar jobs tend to regret their tattoos more. And we actually found from a racial standpoint that African Americans are more likely to be bothered by their doctor and dentist having a tattoo than any other group within our findings. What we find out really from the study is that maybe HR professionals are out of sync with society, because when surveying HR professionals, 80% are more likely not to hire somebody with a tattoo for a job over somebody who does not have a tattoo. Thank you.
Nice. I want to go to every breakout room. Can I just clone myself so that I can go talk to all of y'all? Now we're on to Dr. Joan Simon from the College of Health and Behavioral Sciences.
Thank you, Joy. Yes, this is a real treat. Or was it Sandy that introduced me? I guess it was Sandy.
That's okay.
This is a real treat to listen to what everyone is doing. And I think we're all taking it in such different directions, our interests, which is wonderful. My approach that I'm going to present today is a very kind of traditional approach compared to some of the things that we've talked about already today. That is my work as chair of our departmental diversity committee in the psychology and counseling department. And one of the things that we wanted to do as we kind of embarked on some new work in our department a couple of years ago was to get a sense of how do students feel about issues in our department? How do they feel about being connected to our department? How do they feel about feeling safe in our department, valued in our department, those types of things. And so we actually did a little bit of, the diversity committee did a little bit of research to see what kind of scales might be out there in the literature and available to us, and really didn't find something that we felt like really met the need that we had. So we put one together ourselves. And in the fall of 2020, we piloted the survey in our department. We did some work with some small student groups before we put it in front of the entire department. But what we did was we sent out, for about 3 months, we sent out notifications to students through classes, signs in the hallway, those types of things, asking students to participate in this student inclusiveness survey. And this would have been this was for any student who was taking a class in our department that semester. So we wanted to know, even if you weren't a major or a graduate student in our department, what are your feelings about the psychology department? And so over those 3 weeks, we were able to secure about 1,300, a little more than 1,300 responses. I'm sorry, 1,300 students who were taking the classes in our department that semester. And we ended up with about 650 responses. So we felt like that was a pretty good indicator of what, who was in our department, and good representative sample. And as I mentioned here, we also had 4 sections on our student survey, kind of their general impressions of the department, their impressions of what goes on in the classroom, impressions of peers, and then some ideas for future activities they might be interested in being part of. Next slide, please. So basically what we did, we compiled the results and shared them with our faculty, but I just kind of highlighted a couple of results here. Looking at those 3 broad sections that I just mentioned, general impressions, classroom impressions, and peer impressions, overall, we felt like as we looked at all of the groups, all of the students who participated in the survey, our means on those scales, kind of the average item mean, was very close to the highest possible score. So those who participated had very positive things to say about their role in the department and their feelings of comfort in the department. We did find some group differences, though, between our white students and students who are Black, Latinx, or those who are biracial or multiracial. And so if you see, in all 3 of those sections, we did have some differences between those groups, that our white students tended to have a little bit higher ratings in terms of their impressions of the department than other student groups. However, the ratings were all high. I mean, within just maybe a point or two of one another. So, I mean, they were all above average ratings, and that made us, you know, feel good, but certainly there were some differences there to be seen. Next slide, please. And so taking from, as we looked across all of our participants, we identified some items that had the lowest overall ratings in each of these three areas. And these are just some examples of the items that were on there. But these were the areas or the items that tended to be rated lowest by students. And so we felt like these might be some areas for improvement in the future. And so you can see there are a few of them in each of the three categories in terms of what students would like to see that they were not seeing. And so what this has done is given us an opportunity to have some greater discussion as a faculty about how students feel in our department, as well as some ideas for what we can do to make improvements in our department. And after we presented, well, after we did the student survey, we did a parallel survey with faculty and staff members in our department. And then we shared all of that with our faculty. And through a number of discussions, kind of came up with some ideas for activities that we'd like to have in our department to, or some action steps we could take to make some improvements in what we're doing in the department to help students feel more included. I feel like I didn't take a breath. I don't know.
Thank you so much.
Was the timing good?
All right. And we're going to wrap up with the College of Education and hear from both Dr. Wake and Dr. Parham.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for being here. So our research basically just comes with the understanding that we recognize how important it is to have equity conversations. I think we all would agree that that's an important skill set, is something that every organization needs to have the ability to do. But I think we also would agree that when you look globally and nationally, some people are getting it right, some people are getting it wrong, and we got to figure out, like, what our question was: how do we? What's the framework to have an effective atmosphere for equity conversations? So we did it's kind of an autoethnography / ethnography. We were a part of the study, but we also had people that are participants or our co-workers. So we lived with 6 of us, and we went through a process. We went through it was it Donna? How many? Was it about? How long did we go through this process?
Well, yeah, the formal procedures were a year, and then we have engaged in continued conversations for another year.
So what we looked at was that initial year. We would have these sessions with the consultant from the Disruptive Education Equity Project. And what we did is we looked at the 6 stages and we analyzed what were the components of these conversations, what emerged, what came out that required, that allowed us to have this effective conversation, these effective conversations. So if you look, we noticed 3 things: common language, and that was a DBIE, just understanding what is diversity, what is belonging, what is inclusion, what is equity. Then having an understanding of oppression. What does that mean when we talk about systemic oppression? And then establishing a safe place, which was the ethos. So we studied these 3 components and realized if these things are brought in with intentionality, they create a platform for atmosphere for equity conversations. And so Donna's just going to share our findings based out of these three pieces.
So I would say a positive, and can we go to the next slide, please? A positive bonus to me in engaging in this research has been the relationship I've been able to develop with my colleague, Charlotte. We spent almost a year looking at the recorded transcripts from all of our sessions that we had together and coding all of that, trying to dig into, of those 3 constructs that we use to establish a foundation for our shared language, what were the things that really stood out as critical pieces for furthering and supporting these conversations? And it turns out that the belonging, the B, that's the addition that's unique to our model, was the critical piece. So a lot of places in the country talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, but they don't have that B piece. And it turned out the belonging was critical. And in terms of the ethos, the lean into discomfort was the piece that was really critical for us to reckon with in order to have these conversations with one another. And for the next slide. And what we also found were some correlations in the data. And we know correlation is not causation, but when we really dug into the correlations, what we could see was that the construct of belonging and the construct of inclusion were more highly correlated with the interpersonal and internalized spaces of conversation we were having with each other, whereas diversity and equity, which were maybe a little bit more abstract, were more closely tied to conversations where we were in ideological or institutional conversation spaces. And we are out of time because I had my timer running.
I will add to just one little thing is that that's important to note, like that the diversity is more institutional and belonging speaks to more interpersonal. And the reason why that's important is because a lot of times we try to do the work of diversity and not do the work of belonging, and it does not give us the results that we need to. It's hard to jump and do institutional work without doing the personal work of ourselves.
Thank you all so much. Just so much to think about. And now we are going to break out into breakout groups. So you should, thank you. Well, welcome back everybody. And thank you to the panelists. Just so fascinating to see this topic covered in such broad ways across the thing. But the common theme two common themes that seem to come up were belonging and how important that was. So in all of these areas, you know, tattoos in the workplace or how we feel within a certain department, how our students feel, whether they belong. And Dr. Anderson's examples of Pat Parker's, you know, sense of belonging and where that fit in her both literary life, but her social life as well. So I wondered if the panelists could talk about working towards a sense of belonging. I was talking about this, we're moving towards a majority minority population. And so what do you think are the most important things we need to think about, both as educators, but just as citizens, in terms of forming communities that have a sense of belonging for as many people as possible? So any of the panelists who have thoughts on steps we can take, ways we can view the world to encourage a sense of belonging. They can be related to academia, but they could just be related to the world in general.
I'll start. I think it's important for people to have the ability to recognize like multiple perspectives and truly understand that, okay, I feel like I belong in this space, and somebody who's completely different than me can sit right beside me and they feel like they belong in the same space. Like, we have to be intentional to make sure that we both feel like we're in the same space and not pull from each other. Like, I can accept you and I can celebrate who you are, and we both can belong, and I can keep my identity. Like, I think that there's this narrative that in order for me to understand or appreciate somebody else, it takes from who I am. And I think just speaking to that, like just right there is a good place to start, because that's what we don't want to do. We don't want people to feel like, oh, I'm going to make you feel like you belong, but for me to make you feel like you belong, you're not going to feel like, I'm not going to do it at the expense of any other demographic. And that's critical, because part of the pushback we get in this equity space is that people feel like they don't belong anymore.
And so you recommend just having that conversation, just stating that out, that in welcoming others, we are not detracting from ourselves, or nobody's asking, like literally verbalizing those thoughts.
I do think it's important, because that's what comes up in people's mind. The threats are going to be there. It's going to happen. People are going to have all these emotions about how is this going to impact me, and addressing that on the front end creates an atmosphere for healthy conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Parham. Anybody else from the panel have thoughts on that?
I would just like to add to what Dr. Parham said is that don't be afraid to ask, but don't get mad to answer. So many times, especially when, like in my research's case, when we're talking about tattoos, there's something that have meaning, but people will be afraid to ask, what's that mean? What is that memoriam you have? Who's it for? But then people also get uncomfortable and angry when people ask them. And people are kind of on edge all the time. So, not stating quite as well what Dr. Parham said, it's about having the freedom to have a conversation, both directions.
Yeah, I think that's important to recognize too. Thank you.
You mentioned, building on Dr. Lewis's presentation, was how important it is for people that are making important decisions to have cultural competency, thinking about the HR professionals and their views and how those aren't really representative anymore of the main basis of decisions and the appropriate way to make decisions equitably. And I know I myself have a lot more work to do, but the better that we can all, as particularly faculty, work to train ourselves and get out of our own comfort zone to understand diverse perspectives, I think that's really important. So I definitely know I have more cultural competency to gain. And I think that's really important for underrepresented groups because the mainstream media and mainstream narrative is so privileged. And I see that definitely in STEM.
Yeah. Yeah, I was struck by the presentation that in STEM, you're being asked to mentor, but there's no training in mentorship. And as someone who teaches creative writing, my whole career has been being asked to mentor students with no training in mentorship. So that kind of turns to my next. People just think, oh, you're in the humanities, you know how to talk to people about difficult subjects and emotional subjects, because that's what literature is about. So how do we work on mentorship? Like, if we recognize that diversity, belonging, these are important issues, how do we work on mentorship if there isn't, this has to become intuitive to us? I don't know if I'm asking the question correctly, but how do you see yourselves as educators doing that mentoring is maybe a way to ask that. Maybe that's too daunting of a question.
One thing that came up in our breakout room was, how do you be a mentor when you yourself haven't had a mentor, maybe? Yes. And that's a pretty hard one. And there's probably people in this room that might not feel like they've had a strong mentor or currently have one. And so how do you find that voice when you don't have a model to work from? That's a really hard question too, but I think we can look to peer mentors too for input, and not being not afraid of talking about it, of strategies and challenges that we face. Definitely being willing to go tap on the shoulder of a peer and talk to, well, I'm having this challenge with my mentee. Have you ever seen this, or how do you work around it? I know for myself, I don't do that as often as I probably should, but want to more. That's
a great piece of advice. Joy, maybe one of our next ones next year needs to be about mentorship.
Yeah, that would be great.
As a symposium. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd like to just make a comment about what Ben said in the chat, and that is, that lean into your discomfort kind of idea. And I think we all have to do that to an extent. We didn't know what we'd find when we surveyed our students, just like we didn't know what we'd find when we surveyed our faculty. And, coming with that knowledge of how people feel in the department, we have a responsibility to try to make things better for students. And so that's means we might be doing things differently. That means we might be adding something that we didn't have before. That means that I might have to be part of an activity that I didn't think that I would be part of. But I think that we all have a role to play in improving things at our university, improving the climate. Even if it's our small program, we have influence and, can make a difference. We have to kind of step into that.
Definitely. And I just will end with this idea that came up from all of you too, is the idea of transparency while doing these things, is being open about the research you're doing, and being open about this is not a forced sort of thing, but it's an ongoing difficult conversation. And we're going to be transparent about our goals and why we're doing the kinds of things we're doing. So saying those things on the front end, like Dr. Parham was talking about, so that it is not a sense of I'm trying to take power from someone else. This is for the benefit of the community, kind of thing. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Joy, because we're out of time.
Thank you all. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to our presenters, to our URC members, and to everyone who came today. I will send out a brief survey about the event, and it will include the question like, what topic would you like to suggest we do symposiums on next year? So please think about that, because we like having ideas that you all are excited about. And thank you. And let's just give our presenters some virtual applause. They did a great job. This is really exciting. I appreciate everyone who showed up and shared their X period with us. Thank you. And I'll also send out the slides. So you'll have the slideshow if you want to reach out and contact anyone, and you'll have all that information. So thank you again.